Picture this. A man spends 45 years building brains, not metaphorically, actual brains made of aluminum and steel and oil and fire. He builds the nervous systems of the most violent machines on Earth, top fuel dragsters, funny cars, boats that run 180 miles an hour on water that is supposed to be flat. By the late 1970s, if a car is breaking a national record in this sport, there is a near certainty that his engine is in it. From 1975 to 1984, every single top fuel national record belongs to a car running one of his engines, every one for 10 straight years. Then sometime in 1990 or early 1991, something starts growing in his own brain, and it does not stop. On May 13, 1991, in Downey, California, Keith Black dies of brain cancer at the age of 64. The medical details of his illness have never been made public. His family decided that what was happening inside Keith's head was going to stay inside the family. And so the man whose initials KB became the universal shorthand for Nitro engine excellence took the specifics of his own ending with him. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the men who built motorsport from the ground up with their bare hands and nobody ever told you about. If you're someone who loves the real, unfiltered history of racing, the builders, the engineers, the quiet giants who shaped the sport and never got a headline for it, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. This is the story of how he got there. To understand who Keith Black was, you have to understand what drag racing looked like before he existed in it. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a top fuel dragster was essentially a homemade contraption, a welded frame, an axle in the front, a couple of tires in the back, an engine mounted ahead of the driver where it would happily explode into his lap. The fuel was nitromethane, which is closer to a controlled bomb than to gasoline. The men driving these things were brave to the point of being slightly unhinged, and the men building the engines were doing it in their backyards with whatever they could afford. There were no factory teams, there was no science, there was almost no money. What there was a small cluster of self-taught mechanics in Southern California who were trying to figure out how to make a Chrysler Hemi survive being fed something that wanted to detonate. The ones who could figure that out built reputations. The ones who could not blew up engines. Here's the thing, that environment was not just chaotic, it was genuinely dangerous in ways that today's regulated, sponsored, televised drag racing simply cannot replicate. According to National Hot Rod Association records from the period, mechanical failures causing serious injury or death were common enough in the early 1960s that the sport existed in a constant negotiation between spectacle and catastrophe. The line between a record-setting run and a funeral was sometimes measured in thousandths of an inch of tolerancing inside an engine casing. Keith Black was born on June 25, 1926, in either Huntington Park or Linwood, California, depending on which source you trust. They are next-door cities in southeast Los Angeles County, so the difference does not really matter. His father was a preacher. That last detail is going to matter a lot later. He grew up the way a lot of Southern California kids grew up in the 1930s and 1940s, which is to say obsessed with anything mechanical. The famous story, which Keith told himself in interviews for the rest of his life, happened when he was about 14. He talked his mother into letting him take the family car apart while his parents were at church. By the time they came home, there was a deconstructed automobile sitting in the driveway and a teenager surrounded by it, explaining calmly that he was trying to understand why the engine needed a rebuild. His father, in Keith's own words, about croaked. Now, you might be thinking that story sounds like a legend, like something people polish up over decades until it becomes mythology. But here is what most people do not realize about Keith Black. He was not the kind of man who polished his own stories. He was the kind of man who gave the same matter-of-fact account of events in 1975 that he had given in 1965, without embellishment, without performance. The car story is credible precisely because he never made it bigger than it was. It was just something he did because he wanted to understand how the thing worked. That impulse, that need to understand the mechanism at its most fundamental level, is the thread that runs through every single thing he ever built. He graduated high school in the early 1940s, went into the Army Air Corps cadet program, never got called up because the war ended before his training did, and then started apprenticing in the speed shops of Southern California. The names he worked under are a roster of the foundation generation of American hot rodding. Clay Smith, the camshaft and timing genius. Art Sparks, the induction and Indianapolis-era engineer. Cliff Collins. Some sources add Vic Edelbrock Sr. to that list. His son, Ken Black, later said that working with Clay Smith was the breakthrough. Clay Smith taught him about camshafts and about timing. And the key insight Ken said his father got from that apprenticeship was that the block of an engine is really just a container. It holds the parts. The camshaft and the timing are what make everything actually happen. Think about that for a second as an analogy. Most people look at an engine and see the block, the big heavy thing, the obvious thing, the thing that takes up space. What Clay Smith taught Keith Black was to look past the container and see the timing sequence inside it as the real source of power. It is the difference between seeing a building and seeing the electrical system running through its walls. That single idea, that the block is just a vessel and the timing is the engine's actual nervous system, is the seed of everything Keith Black would build for the next 45 years. In the mid-1940s, while he was still apprenticing, he started messing around with boat engines. And here is where the legend starts. The second time he ever ran a boat at the Salton Sea, he set a world record. The second time. He had no business doing that and he did it anyway. People in the Southern California boat racing scene took notice. Somebody asked him to build them an engine, then somebody else asked. He told the story years later in the simplest possible way. He raced boats for a bit himself, then someone said, "Come build an engine for me." And he built a flathead for him, and then somebody else would say, "Well gee, that ran good, build me one." And someone else would want one, and so on. He got started in his backyard in the engine business. He was running Ford flatheads at first, and then moved up to the Chrysler Hemi Marines. The 246 cubic inch Dodge Red Ram. The 265 cubic inch DeSoto Hemi. By 1961, his name was on roughly 50 different international and national boat racing records. He was unquestionably the dominant engine builder in inland lakes marathon boat racing. The Salton City 500 was being called the Indy 500 of endurance boat racing, and Keith Black was the man you went to if you wanted to actually finish it, much less win it. He also drove. He drove well. And then at some point in there, he had a serious accident. Nobody who has written about Keith Black has ever provided the details of this accident, which is itself an interesting piece of evidence about the kind of man he was. We do not know what year it happened, or what kind of boat he was in, or how badly he was hurt. What we know is that it scared him enough that, combined with the responsibility of a young family and a wife named Jane, who he had married in 1946, he made the decision to stop driving and to focus entirely on building engines. That decision changed everything that came after it. In 1959, he opened Keith Black Racing Engines, KBRE. By 1961, he had those 50 boat records on the wall, and that was the point at which the drag racing community started showing up at his door. The most persistent of them was a man named Tommy Greer. Greer had been a boat racing customer of Keith's for years. He kept telling Keith that he should put one of his engines in a dragster. Keith kept telling him no. Keith was not a drag racer. He did not know anything about drag racing. He had built his entire reputation on the water. But Tommy Greer kept asking. And eventually, in 1962, Keith said fine. Greer bought a chassis from Kent Fuller. They hired a 21-year-old car painter named Don Prudhomme to drive it. Prudhomme had been hanging around with Tommy Evo and getting some seat time, but he was essentially a kid with raw talent and no real reputation yet. Kent Fuller had recommended him to Keith. Look, the combination of those four elements, Greer's money, Fuller's chassis, Prudhomme's talent, and Black's engine, is the kind of thing that in motorsport history you look back on and marvel at. Because none of them individually could have produced what they produced together. Greer was a customer, not an engineer. Fuller was a fabricator, not a power builder. Prudhomme was a driver with instincts but no platform. And Keith was an engine builder who had never built a drag racing engine in his life. Put them all in a room together in 1962, and what comes out is one of the most dominant race cars in American motorsport history. The car that came out of that arrangement is one of the most famous race cars ever built. The Greer, Black, and Prudhomme Top Fuel Dragster. Painted orange at first, then yellow. Powered by Keith's blown Nitro Chrysler 392 Hemi. It debuted at Pomona in June 1962. Here's what most people don't realize about that car's record. The numbers vary depending on which source you go with, but the most commonly cited figure is that the GBP car ran over 250 eliminator rounds in 1962 and 1963 and lost fewer than 25 of them. Other sources put the loss column even lower, at around 10, with 4 of those losses being against jet cars, which are not really a fair comparison. Either way, the dragster was as close to unbeatable as anything in the sport had ever been. To put that in perspective, imagine a baseball team going through 2 full seasons and losing fewer than 10 games. It is not just dominance, it is a different category of performance from everyone else on the field. In 1964 at San Gabriel Dragstrip, Keith's engine put up a 7.77 second elapsed time at 196.30 miles per hour. That was the first verified 7-second pass, and it put Keith Black on the map nationally. This is where it gets really interesting because that 7-second run was not just a record, it was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that the combination of an aluminum-headed iron-block Chrysler Hemi running on nitromethane with the right cam profile and the right timing, built by someone who understood that the timing was the engine and the block was just a container, could produce numbers that nobody in the sport had thought were achievable yet. Every single advancement in top fuel technology after that point traces a line back through this car and this engine and this moment at San Gabriel in 1964. Now, during this 2-year run, something else was happening that the stat sheets do not capture. Keith was getting to know Don Prudhomme, and Prudhomme was getting to know Keith. The picture that comes out of the years of interviews Prudhomme has given since is one of the most revealing windows into who Keith Black actually was as a human being. Prudhomme said it was unbelievable how smart Keith was. He said that when Keith Black first called him on the phone, he did not even know who Keith Black was because he was so new to the sport. He found out fast. But the more important thing Prudhomme noticed was the kind of human being Keith was. Ed Pink, who was Keith's main rival engine builder for the entire span of Keith's career, would stay late at the track, shoot dice, and gamble with the boys. That was as far from Keith's mind as you could get. Keith did not do any of that. His father had been a preacher, and so the guys started calling him the Reverend Mr. Black. He was a clean-cut guy. He did not like off-color jokes. He was not that kind of hot rodder. They were pretty wild, and he used to kind of get on them about it. They thought he was kind of square. And that is the most revealing thing anyone ever said about Keith Black in any interview I have ever read about him. Because in a sport that was defined by a certain flavor of outlaw energy, by the fuel ban that the NHRA imposed and then lifted, by the gambling and the side betting and the characters who populated the pits at Lions Drag Strip on a Friday night, Keith Black was genuinely, authentically square. Not performatively square, not square as a bit. Actually square. His father was a preacher and Keith was the preacher's son, and he never stopped being that even when he was building engines that ran on what was essentially rocket fuel. That nickname is the key to understanding Keith Black. The Reverend Mr. Black. He was the grown-up in a sport full of overgrown teenagers. He functioned as a kind of father figure to the men who drove cars with his engines in them. Don Prudhomme, Roland Leong, eventually Shirley Muldowney, Kenny Bernstein, John Force, Joe Amato, and a list of others long enough that you could just say virtually every top fuel and funny car driver of consequence in the sport at some point had a Keith Black engine in their car. And Keith treated all of them the same way. There were no sponsorships. There were no discounts. Everybody paid the same price. Keith said it himself in an interview with hot rod writer Dave Wallace in 1979. The fact that they all buy our stuff and they all pay the same price, because we don't sponsor anybody, means it's accepted as the best. That to me is like winning a race. That was the entire business philosophy in one sentence. You do not have to give your product away to prove it is good. If it is actually good, people will pay for it. And if everybody pays the same price, then the product's excellence is the only variable. It is a philosophy that any business school would recognize immediately, and Keith arrived at it by pure instinct sometime in the mid-1960s, operating out of a shop in Southgate, California, without ever having taken a business class in his life. In 1963, when the NHRA lifted its Nitro ban and rescheduled the Pomona race, Keith found out that Prudhomme had scheduled his wedding to Lynn for the same weekend. Prudhomme was ready to cancel the wedding. Keith told him not to. "Go get married," Keith said. "Do what you're doing." That is the Reverend Mr. Black in a single sentence. And here is the thing about that moment that gets overlooked. Keith needed Prudhomme at that race. The GBP car was competitive for every event, and having your driver at the wheel mattered. But Keith's personal moral code, the idea that a man's wedding takes priority over a race, was not something he was willing to negotiate on, even when the negotiation would have benefited him directly. That is not just a nice story. That is evidence of character under pressure. By late 1964, the Greer-Black-Prudhomme partnership was winding down. Tommy Greer was moving back into drag boat. Keith was getting busier with the engine business. Don Prudhomme had also had a serious crash at Long Beach in a blown gas hydroplane that fall, and Keith had been furious about it. He felt that Prudhomme had no business risking his life driving for one of Keith's engine-building competitors. It was one of the only times the two men ever fell out. They patched it up, but the partnership was effectively over. At about the same time, a young man named Roland Leong, who had crashed his own dragster at Lyons Drag Strip, came to Keith and asked Keith to build his engines. Keith agreed on one condition. Roland was not allowed to drive the car himself. Keith thought Leong was going to get himself killed behind the wheel. Keith recommended Prudhomme. That arrangement became the Hawaiian Top Fuel dragster, and it ran into the late 1960s. In 1965, the Chrysler Corporation walked through Keith's door. They had been watching what he was doing with their engines, and they offered him a contract to develop their marine racing program. Now, you might be thinking, why would a company the size of Chrysler come to a backyard engine builder in Southgate? Here's what most people don't realize. By 1965, Keith Black was not a backyard engine builder anymore in any meaningful sense. He was the most decorated marine engine builder in America, with 50 national and international records on his wall, and he was simultaneously building the engines for the most dominant top-fuel dragster the sport had ever seen. Chrysler was not doing Keith a favor by offering that contract. Chrysler was trying to borrow credibility that they had not earned, and Keith had. The contract was the beginning of a multi-decade factory relationship that would put Keith Black inside the Chrysler engineering ecosystem in a way that no other independent builder ever managed. He had access to engineering data, to factory prototypes, to internal testing resources that his competitors simply could not touch. Ed Pink was talented. Keith was talented and connected. That combination proved to be unassailable. By the late 1960s, he was supplying engines to Roland Leong, Big John Masmanian, Tommy Evo, Connie Kalita, John Mulligan, and a growing list of others. His shop was outgrowing whatever space he had. In 1966, he moved KBRE to 11120 Scott Avenue in Southgate, California. That address would become a pilgrimage site for Nitro racers for the next 25 years. In the same era, he started solving one of drag racing's biggest problems: the starts. In the early days of Nitro racing, the launch involved the driver dropping the clutch and the car producing a tower of black smoke from the rear tires as the rubber instantly vaporized. It was dramatic. It was also slow. Keith pioneered the development of what came to be called the slipper clutch, which engaged progressively instead of all at once. Think about this like trying to get a car moving on an icy hill. If you dump the throttle all at once, you spin the wheels and go nowhere. If you apply power progressively and let the tires find grip, you actually move forward. The slipper clutch applied that same principle to a Nitro dragster, making somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 horsepower, and the result was not a tower of smoke, it was a launch that transferred power to the track. The slipper clutch effectively ended the rubber burn era. After Keith's clutch work, the cars started getting violent traction off the line instead of just smoking the tires. That single innovation reshaped how top fuel dragsters got down the track. And here is the thing about that innovation that tends to get buried under the engine records. Keith was not supposed to be a clutch guy. He was an engine builder. The clutch was a separate system that another specialist could have improved. But Keith saw the entire drivetrain as a single system, and he was not going to let the launch efficiency undermine the power his engine was producing. That systems-level thinking is what separated him from the men who were merely good at building engines. But the work that really cemented his name in the sport happened in 1973 and 1974. By the early 1970s, the cast-iron Chrysler Hemi blocks that everybody was running had a fundamental problem. They were heavy. They were expensive to repair when a connecting rod came out the side, which in Nitro racing happens with enough frequency that it is essentially a cost of doing business. And they were getting harder and harder to find as Chrysler moved on from the Hemi. In 1971, Ed Donovan had introduced the Donovan 417, which was an aluminum copy of the older Chrysler 392 Hemi. It was a step forward, but it was based on the older, smaller engine. What Keith did with the help of a Chrysler engineer named Bob Tarazzi was develop an all-aluminum version of the bigger 426 Hemi. They started in 1973 and released it for sale in 1974. The KB Elephant Block, the aluminum 426 Hemi. That block was the shot heard around the world in drag racing. It saved approximately 100 pounds of dead weight. It could be repaired when a rod came through the side. A catastrophic failure on an iron block that ended the engine's life entirely became a reparable incident on an aluminum block. It was lighter and stronger and faster than anything anybody had ever offered to the Nitro community. And within a few years, nearly every successful top fuel and funny car team in the world was running one. This is where it gets really interesting, because the block solved a problem that the sport did not even fully know it had. The teams running iron blocks had adapted to the weight and the cost because they had no alternative. Keith's aluminum block did not just improve on the iron block, it made the iron block obsolete in a single product release. Don Garlits, years later, put it as simply as possible. The aluminum 426 Hemi block was probably the biggest contribution to top fuel drag racing, and that was all thanks to Keith Black. What a great man for drag racing. Between 1975 and 1984, every single top fuel national record set by the NHRA belonged to a car running a Keith Black engine. 10 straight years. Let that sit for a second. 10 years. 3 presidential administrations. 2 complete generations of drag racing technology. The sport was changing constantly during that period. The tracks were getting better, the fuels were getting more refined, the tune-ups were getting more sophisticated, the cars were getting more aerodynamically developed, and through all of that change, through every external variable and competitive pressure, Keith Black's engines held every national record for a decade without interruption. Hot Rod magazine eventually put Keith on its list of the top 100 hot rodders of all time. The Carcraft Magazine All-Star Drag Racing Team Award for Best Dragster Engine Builder went to Keith 10 times between 1967 and 1981. He won Best Funny Car Engine Builder 3 times. He won Best Fuel Racing Manufacturer twice. In 1978, he won the Carcraft Ollie Award for overall contribution to the sport. The shop at Southgate was running 35 employees at the peak. They had built nearly 800 aluminum blocks by the late 1970s alone. The dyno room ran constantly. Ken Black, who was Keith's son and who would eventually take over the business, said they had to have 5 or 6 guys in the dyno room just to keep up. The Chrysler relationship had grown into a major chunk of the business. Keith was supplying engines to top fuel teams in England, Sweden, Canada, Australia, and the United States. Now, you might be thinking that a business that dominant must have had enormous prices, that Keith was exploiting his market position. And here is what most people do not realize. The uniform pricing policy Keith had always run meant that the national championship teams and the regional club racers were paying exactly the same rate for their components. He was not gouging the successful teams who had no choice but to run his block. He was not giving discounts to the famous drivers to keep them in his corner. The price was the price, and the price was the same for everyone. That is not just ethical practice. In a sport where the engine builder's relationship with the driver was often defined by trading parts for publicity, it was genuinely radical. Keith had no interest in publicity. He had interest in excellence. As Keith himself put it, the fact that they all bought his stuff at the same price meant it was accepted as the best. That to me is like winning a race. By the mid-1980s, he was branching out. KBRE introduced a line of GM-based engine blocks intended for gasoline applications. Chevrolet built what came to be called the Keith Black Camaro, which was a hot rod magazine project car that ran low 11s in the quarter mile and pulled a full G on the skid pad. The hot rod feature ran in March 1987. Keith Black at 60 was diversifying, building street performance blocks, building marine, still building top fuel. He had transcended being a drag racing engine builder. He had become an institution. In 1986, the SEMA Hall of Fame inducted him. That would prove to be the only major Hall of Fame induction Keith Black would ever attend as a living man. The ones that came after, the ones from the organizations that waited until he was gone to recognize him, arrived too late for him to receive them in person. In December of 1986, Hot Rod magazine ran what would turn out to be one of the most important interviews of his career, a long-form retrospective on what he had built and how he had built it. Through the late 1980s, a top fuel driver named Gary Ormsby was running Keith Black engines exclusively. Ormsby and his team had developed an extremely close relationship with Keith and his shop, and in 1989, Ormsby won the NHRA Top Fuel Championship using Keith Black power. It would prove to be one of the last great moments of Keith's life as a fully active engine builder. 1989 was also the year that Keith himself turned 63. He had been building engines professionally for over 4 decades. He had outlasted every major competitor. Ed Pink was still operating, but the market had spoken conclusively about whose product was preferred. Keith had watched the sport he helped create transform from a backyard Saturday afternoon enterprise into a nationally televised, commercially sponsored, multi-million-dollar industry. And through all of that transformation, the fundamental physics he had mastered in his backyard in the late 1940s remained the foundation. The cam profile, the timing, the understanding that the block was just a container and what lived inside the container was what mattered. Sometime in 1990 or early 1991, something started going wrong. Nobody outside of the family has ever said what the first symptoms were. Here's the thing about aggressive brain tumors. The conventional course is that the early signs are subtle and easily dismissed. Headaches that do not go away, trouble with words, maybe a problem with motor control or with vision. They are the kinds of symptoms that a man who has spent his entire life solving mechanical problems might attribute to fatigue, to stress, to the accumulated wear of 4 decades of working around engines and noise and chemical fumes. Then eventually a scan, then a diagnosis. We do not know any of that for Keith Black. What we know is that at some point in the months before May of 1991, Keith Black was told that he had brain cancer. The specific type of tumor has never been disclosed. No source has ever named it. Not Wikipedia, not the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America, not the official Keith Black Racing Engines history, not Don Prudhomme, not Roland Leong, not Don Garlits, not any of the dozens of magazine retrospectives that have been written about him since. The family kept it. Whatever surgery he had, whatever treatment he received, whoever the doctors were at whichever hospital, it all stayed inside the family. For a man who had spent 45 years being one of the most visible figures in drag racing, the privacy around his ending is itself a kind of statement. Now, you might be thinking that the privacy around his illness is unusual, that someone of Keith's stature in the sport would have had his illness covered extensively. But here is what most people do not realize about how drag racing operated in 1991. This was not Formula One. This was not IndyCar. The beat reporters covering NHRA drag racing were a small, tight-knit community, and the culture of the sport in that era still carried a deep working-class ethic around privacy. Your personal business was your personal business. You did not talk about your health. You did not talk about your money. You did not talk about what was happening in your family. Keith had operated his entire career on that ethos. He did not give personal interviews. He gave technical interviews. He talked about cam profiles and ignition timing and the properties of nitromethane as a fuel. He did not talk about himself. And so when he got sick, the family extended that same ethic to the end of his life. The Reverend Mr. Black went out the way he had lived, quietly, without theatrics, on his own terms. On May 13, 1991, Keith Black died in Downey, California. He was 64 years old. The cause of death was recorded as complications due to brain cancer. He was buried at Rose Hills Memorial Park in Whittier, California, in the Garden of Serenity, Section 11, Lot 3557, Grave 4. No public account of his funeral exists. We do not have a list of who attended. We do not have the text of any eulogy. We do not know who spoke. Given the size of the man's reach in drag racing, it is impossible to imagine that the service was anything less than a gathering of everyone who mattered in the Southern California Nitro community. But the records of it never made it into the public sphere. His widow, Jane, survived him. So did his son, Ken. The year 1991 was a brutal one for the drag racing community. 3 months after Keith died, Gary Ormsby, the man who had just won a championship with Keith's engines, died on August 28 of intestinal cancer. He was 49. Joe Pisano died. Wild Willie Borsch died. Richard Holcomb died. Gene Beaver died. It was an obituary year. But the loss that defined it was Keith. Within weeks of his death, Don Prudhomme would say it was unbelievable how smart Keith Black had been. Don Garlits would say what a great man for drag racing. Ed Pink, Keith's rival for 30 years, would say that when you raced against him, you knew you were going up against someone special. John Asher, who had edited Carcraft magazine, put it in the most direct terms anybody used. Keith Black's influence on drag racing is probably immeasurable. Black's development of the aluminum Hemi elevated drag racing into what might be termed the modern era. These are not the kinds of things people say about someone who was merely good at his job. These are the kinds of things people say about someone who fundamentally changed the nature of the work that everyone around him was doing. And the fact that all 3 of those men, Prudhomme, Garlits, and Pink, one his partner, one his champion, one his lifelong rival, arrived at essentially the same assessment independently tells you something important about how universally his contribution was understood within the sport. In 1992, 1 year after his death, the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame at the Don Garlits Museum in Ocala, Florida inducted him. In 1995, the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America inducted him into its drag racing category. Both inductions were posthumous. The honors that Keith had earned arrived after he was no longer there to receive them. He had been inducted into one Hall of Fame during his lifetime, SEMA in 1986, and had stood up to accept it in person. Everything else came after May 13, 1991. Now, look, there is something worth sitting with about that pattern. The SEMA induction in 1986 recognized his contribution to the performance aftermarket industry broadly. The drag racing halls of fame came later because drag racing's institutional memory moved slower. And that delay is itself a kind of evidence about how the sport perceived him. He was so fundamental to what they were doing every day that they did not think of him as a historical figure while he was still alive and working. He was not a legend yet. He was just Keith. The guy in Southgate. The guy whose block was in your car. The guy who would pick up the phone at 11 at night and talk timing with you if you were having a problem. You do not build a Hall of Fame plaque for the person you can still call on the phone. Ken Black took over the business. The shop at 11120 Scott Avenue kept running. The aluminum 426 Hemi blocks kept coming out. The KB engines kept winning championship. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the company stayed as the dominant brand in Nitro engine technology, even as the cars themselves got faster and faster and the technology evolved beyond anything Keith himself had directly built. The brand carried it. The initials carried it. KB on an engine block still meant something in 2005 that it had meant in 1975. Which in motorsport is essentially an eternity. By the late 2000s, the business was struggling. The drag racing industry had changed. The factory teams with massive sponsorship budgets had become the norm, and the number of independent customer teams capable of supporting a full season of top fuel competition had contracted significantly. A lot of the family-run engine shops that had defined the sport in Keith's era had either closed or been absorbed. The ecosystem that Keith had helped build was changing in ways that made the model he had pioneered, the independent shop supplying premium components to all comers at a uniform price, increasingly difficult to sustain. In December of 2016, Jane Black and Ken Black sold the business assets to a new corporation called Keith Black Incorporated, which was put together by Darren Beale, Tim Banning, and an Australian top-door slammer champion named Victor Bray. Jane and Ken retained a 40% stake. In January of 2018, the new company removed Ken Black from its board. In May of 2018, the new company sued Ken Black and the old company in Los Angeles Superior Court. In June of 2018, the old company filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The transition out of the family was messy. This is where it gets really interesting from a business history perspective, because what happened to Keith Black Racing engines after 2016 is almost a parable about what happens when you try to separate a brand from the human being who created the trust that made the brand valuable. Keith Black's reputation was not a logo. It was not a trade dress. It was not a manufacturing process that could be documented and transferred. It was a set of values, uniform pricing, obsessive attention to technical detail, personal accountability to every customer, that had been embodied by Keith himself and then by Ken as Keith's son and direct inheritor of those values. When those values left the building, the brand retained the initials but lost the thing that the initials had always stood for. The new owners committed to fulfilling all the outstanding back orders that the old company had taken from customers, and they largely succeeded. In 2017, Jane Black died. She had outlived her husband by 26 years. The couple are buried together in the same Garden of Serenity at Rose Hills. Today, in 2026, Keith Black Incorporated operates out of Clearwater, Florida under Tim Banning as president. They still sell cast aluminum Hemi and wedge block. The dealer network includes Ray Barton, Todd Marsh, Tim Banning, and Victor Bray. The original 11120 Scott Avenue shop in Southgate is closed. The Keith Black Stroker Hemi pistons that you can buy at Summit Racing or Butler Performance still carry the KB letter forms. They are stamped on hypereutectic pistons that go into rebuilt small block Chevrolets and Chrysler Street engines in driveways across America. The man has been dead for 35 years. His initials are still on parts being installed today. Here's what most people don't realize when they pick up a set of KB pistons at a swap meet or order them online. They are not just buying a performance component. They are buying a piece of the institutional memory of drag racing. The KB stamp traces a line back through Ken Black's management of the Southgate shop, through Keith's 45 years of engine building, through the apprenticeships with Clay Smith and Art Sparks, all the way back to a 14-year-old kid who took apart the family car while his parents were at church and put it back together by the time they came home. The thing that gets lost in all the institutional history of Keith Black racing engines is the actual man. The Reverend Mr. Black. The clean-cut guy in a sport full of dice-shooting gamblers. The preacher's son who built engines that ran on what was essentially a controlled explosion. The man who refused to give any driver a discount and then stayed up late helping that same driver figure out a tune-up problem for free, because in Keith's mind those were two completely different transactions. The discount would have been charity. The late-night phone call was just doing his job right. The guy who told Don Prudhomme to go get married instead of skipping his wedding to race a dragster. The guy who would not let Roland Leong drive his own car because Keith thought Leong was going to get himself killed. The guy who when his son was a kid told him simply to always work harder than anyone else and good rewards would be sure to come. He was 64 years old when he died. He had been inducted into one Hall of Fame during his lifetime. He had been featured in Hot Rod magazine 4 months before he died as one of the top 100 hot rodders of all time. He was at the absolute peak of the recognition that the sport could give him, and then in less than a year something started growing in his brain that nobody could stop. And it did not matter how many championships he had won or how many records his engines held or how many people in drag racing called him Uncle Keith. The tumor did not care. That is the part of the story that is hardest to reconcile. Keith Black built the brains of Nitro racing. The intake, the combustion chamber, the valve train, the timing, the aluminum block that held all of it together. He understood mechanical systems at a level that the men around him, men who were themselves experts, genuinely could not reach. And the thing that ended him was something inside his own brain that he could not engineer his way out of. He had spent his whole life solving problems with metal. This one was not made of metal. There is no cam profile that fixes a brain tumor. There is no timing adjustment that slows it down. The man who had spent 45 years finding the mechanical solution to every problem he faced ran into the one problem that does not have a mechanical solution. And the family, being the family, kept the details of that problem between themselves and whoever the doctors were. The Reverend Mr. Black deserved that privacy. He had earned it by giving so much of his technical knowledge publicly for so many years. What he left behind is everywhere. Every time a top fuel car runs the quarter mile in the modern era, it does so on top of foundations that Keith Black poured. Every aluminum nitro block traces its lineage back to the elephant that Keith and Bob Tarazzi finished in 1973. Every clutch that engages progressively off the line owes something to the slipper clutch work Keith did in the late 1960s. The pistons in countless street rods carry his initials. The shop in Southgate is closed, but the brand outlived him by 35 years and is still selling product. Here's the thing about legacies in motorsport. They are almost never proportional to the person's public profile during their lifetime. The drivers get the headlines. The drivers get the television time. The drivers get the trading cards and the autograph sessions and the sponsorship deals. The engine builders get the technical interviews in the trade magazines and the handshakes in the pit lane and the quiet satisfaction of watching a car they built run a record that nobody else can touch. Keith Black spent his entire career in that second category. He was not famous in the way that Don Prudhomme was famous or Don Garlits was famous. He was respected. He was trusted. He was the man you called when you needed the work done right. And that kind of reputation, the one built on technical excellence and personal integrity over 4 decades, is ultimately more durable than the kind built on wins and championship titles and television exposure. Don Prudhomme won 4 consecutive NHRA Funny Car Championship. Don Garlits is the greatest top fuel driver in the history of the sport. Both of them would tell you, and both of them have told you in various interviews across the decades, that without Keith Black the careers they had would not have been possible in the form they took. That is the measure of the man. The men who drove his cars are mostly gone now too. Ed Pink, the rival, died in April of 2025. Roland Leong died in December of 2023. Tom McEwen died in 2018. Then Prudhomme is 86. Don Garlits is in his 90s. Kenny Bernstein is still here. The generation that knew Keith Black personally, that could pick up the phone and call him, that had eaten lunch with him in the Southgate shop and watched him work through a cam timing problem on the dyno, is closing out. The institutional memory of who he actually was as a human being, not as a brand, not as a set of initials on a piston, but as the Reverend Mr. Black, the preacher's son who told Prudhomme to go get married, the clean-cut guy who would not stay late to shoot dice, the man who built engines that ran on explosions while living by the ethics of a Sunday school teacher. That memory is becoming historical record rather than living testimony. Which is part of why this story matters to tell now. While Prudhomme is still alive to say it was unbelievable how smart Keith was. While Garlits is still alive to say what a great man for drag racing. Before the only sources left are the magazine archives and the Hall of Fame plaques and the Summit Racing catalog listings for KB hypereutectic pistons. Somewhere in the records of Los Angeles County, there is a death certificate that contains the specific medical details of how Keith Black died. The hospital, the attending physician, the exact cause, maybe even the type of tumor. The family chose to keep that information private when it happened, and the family has continued to keep it private for the entire 35 years since. That is their right. And honestly, it is consistent with everything we do know about who Keith Black was. He spent his entire career letting the work speak for itself. He never wanted credit. He never wanted to be the story. He wanted the engines to be the story. And in death, his family extended that philosophy to its logical conclusion. The work speaks. The man does not have to. When you walk past a row of Nitro top fuel cars in the staging lanes at any NHRA event in 2026, the engines you are looking at are descendants of what Keith Black built. The technology has moved on. The aluminum is different. The clutches are computer-controlled. The fuel systems are different. But the architecture, the bones of the thing, the aluminum 426 block that everything is built around, that is Keith. That is the Reverend Mr. Black still tuning engines from the Garden of Serenity at Rose Hills. He is in every nitro cackle you have ever heard at a racetrack. He is in every set of KB stroker pistons sitting on a Summit warehouse shelf right now waiting to be ordered by some guy who is rebuilding his grandfather's small block in a garage in Indiana. He is in the silence that his family chose to keep about his ending. He is in the work, and the work is everywhere. That is the story of Keith Black, the preacher's son from southeast Los Angeles County, who took apart the family car when he was 14 and never stopped taking things apart for the next 50 years. The man who built the brains of every nitro engine that ever ran in the modern era, and the tumor that grew in his own brain at the end. Whatever specifics of his illness the family took with them, whatever Keith himself thought about it in those final months, we will probably never know. What we have is the work, and the work is enough.